And as the White House tries to build a strategy to fight the Islamic State in Syria, analysts say President Obama could have a very tough time explaining whether potential airstrikes are even legal, especially if the White House takes action without any approval from Congress. Last week, President Obama said he will give lawmakers a say in that strategy. And you may remember last year the president held off on a military strike against the Syrian government so that he could ask Congress first. Congress, by the way, said no. Let's take this to the judge. Fox News senior judicial analyst Judge Andrew Napolitano is with us on the Fox News deck. So we have midterm elections coming up in November.
Right.
And if you are one who looks at the polls and realizes the people are not for this, which they aren't, according to the polls,
right,
why would you take a vote if you don't have to? And then can the president act if they don't?
Well, this is where it gets very political. First, the law, which you've pretty much explained already in your introduction. Under the War Powers Resolution, a 1973 statute enacted by Congress over President Nixon's veto, the President of the United States can dispatch American troops anywhere on the planet outside the U.S. for military hostilities without permission from Congress for 90 days. He just has to give them notice. If he wants to renew it for another 90 days, he's got to give another notice with a couple of more requirements in there. But basically, he can do it for 180 days on his own without the consent of Congress. But then if something goes wrong, the president takes the heat, which is why a lot of presidents have preferred, presidents since this law came into effect, that Congress authorize the military hostilities. So if something goes wrong, the heat is on them.
But in theory, that puts the people on board, because the Congress elected by the people to represent the people.
Absolutely. It also complies with the Constitution, which basically says, literally says, Congress shall declare war. Congress decides when troops go in. The president decides when and how many and what kind of a battle they wage. So the question then is not a legal one. The president could decimate ISIS tomorrow. Military personnel have stated here on Fox it could be done in 90 days and certainly in 180 days. The question is,
well, they said that about the war in Iraq too. So let's continue.
Does he have the political will to do it, or does he prefer that the political heat be taken by Congress? Question one. Question two, which you raised: can this be done in an election year before Election Day?
Yeah, both sides playing politics on this. If you want to make this politics, I really didn't. Jack Goldsmith, who I'm sure you know of.
Yes, I do.
A Harvard law professor, served under President Bush.
Yes.
Has suggested that if you write this thing properly, that it could work very much in the president's favor. Draft it narrowly with specificity about locations, make an end point of this, a time-specific end point, and limit it to Iraq and Syria. That's a lot to ask. It goes against what some of our military folks have said, but that could happen.
I agree with Professor Goldsmith. That would not only be lawful. The Congress can say you can dispatch troops, but you can only dispatch them here, and you can only dispatch them between this window and that window. I agree with Professor Goldsmith. That would work lawfully, and it would probably also work politically, and it might work morally, because it would probably put a stop to these awful barbaric acts that we keep seeing on television.
Yeah, and there's nobody who thinks that shouldn't be stopped. That should be stopped, and must do whatever you can to stop it. But you have to watch what the unintended consequences are. For one, we end up in the middle of two civil wars.
Correct.
For another, we're fighting against a man who already says he has to go because he's gassed his own people, and yet there we are beside him, and we've inherited a region's problems which we have proved over the past 10 years and well before that we can only screw up.
Correct, that we can't manage. We
can only screw up. All we did was screw up.
We also have a president who prefers stealth wars. He prefers wars by drone run by the CIA or the military without acknowledging it, as opposed to the type of invasion that would probably be necessary to take these creeps on.
And some of these creeps, as you put it, have said, well, if all you're going to do is fly your drones overhead, we're just going to keep beheading your people. And can't you see a world where, if this continues, they just start going to places where Americans go all over the world, start kidnapping them, cutting their heads off?
Bottom line, this is up to the personal will and courage of the most unmilitary-like president in the modern era, the president that we have now. He has the authority and he has the power to make his own mind up on this. Can he do it alone, legally? Yes. Can he go to Congress first? Yes.
It's not as if this is a black and white thing, though.
No, it's not.
You have to be careful. As we learned when we went into Iraq, you have to be careful of the bucket that gets overturned and what now spills everywhere, because what has spilled is a vacuum that allowed this thing to happen in the first place. That goes to the war in Iraq, period.
You could very well argue that the reason ISIS came to the fore and gathered its strength and is so vicious is because of the way we botched the war in Iraq.
The facts are there for you.
Because of our presence there in the first place.
And now we have this, and we have to clean it up. And, there are plenty of people who say, let's go now, and plenty of people who say, don't go at all. But we're in that middle place where you got to figure out what's going to work, not for today and for tomorrow, but for a generation or more.
But I think the president should lead. He shouldn't be acting like he's afraid to be president.
Well, no one should be acting like they're afraid to be president. But until this strategy, who knows what they're doing behind the scenes in the first place? I certainly don't.
I don't think any of us knows what it is.
Yeah.
But there's a public appetite for something.
There is. It's complicated and very frightening. Thank you, Judge.
Oh, it's always a pleasure, Shep.